My name is Maria Coffey. I'm originally from England. Since the late 1980s, my home base has been on the west coast of Canada, on Vancouver Island and for a while on a little island off Vancouver Island. In my early 30s, I gave up a career as a teacher because I wanted to pursue a childhood dream of leading an adventurous life. It wasn't as easy or straightforward as I'm making that sound, but I was lucky enough to find a soulmate who I married, who shared my dream. And we became a writer-photographer team and expedition kayakers, traveling the world and diving deeply into other cultures. We never had a plan of how things would unfold, and we still don't really have a plan. We've always stayed open to surprise, ready to follow new paths when they appear. Along the way, I've written 12 books, and I'm the co-owner of an adventure travel company, Hidden Places, and its conservation branch, Elephant Earth. I'm now in my 60s, and I am hoping to carry on leading this kaleidoscopic life for as long as I can.
One of the things you mentioned was your childhood and your childhood dream of living a more adventurous life. What was your childhood like? Did you grow up with siblings? Did you grow up in the outdoors? Were you sporty? Were you more academic?
I had a very sheltered childhood in a very urban setting. I grew up in Wolverhampton in an Irish Catholic community, and I went to a convent school. My parents had emigrated from Ireland before the Second World War, and they both had tough lives. And they wanted their 3 kids, me and my 2 elder brothers, to have good educations, solid careers, and something that I kept hearing as I grew up, security. I guess, unfortunately for them, from an early age, I had really different dreams. My favorite book when I was a kid was Alice in Wonderland. And Alice, I read that book, I don't know how many times, and I was just so intrigued by this girl who kind of disappeared into this other world where everything seemed possible, and it was just full of surprise and sudden changes. And that was kind of, as a kid, I wanted that. I had no idea how you became an Alice in Wonderland. And as I grew older into my teens, the urge for a different kind of life to the one my parents wanted for me, it became a real burning desire. However, I did go to university. I saw getting good marks at school and getting to university, to be honest, as an escape, from the very sort of sheltered life I'd been living. So I went off to Liverpool University, and I was a terrible student. I loved university life, though. Every summer holiday, those long university summer holidays, I went off traveling with friends, hitchhiked across Europe, slept on beaches, worked as a chambermaid along the way. I traveled in Greece and Israel, Morocco, Sweden, Russia, and at the end of all that, I had to find a job, so I became a teacher, and I lasted for 1 year. And then I took off to South America for a year, where I got a teaching job again to keep me going. But I couldn't see how I could sustain this. It was kind of this conundrum, like, what can I do to have a life of traveling the world? And, to be honest, I wasn't a happy teacher. So I ended up back in England and got another teaching job and found myself kind of in a bit of a rut. And I realized I've gone way past my childhood. I hope that's okay.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Please carry on.
So I ended up back in England. So I'm now in my kind of mid-20s, and I have another teaching job. My parents are thrilled. They want me to marry and, settle down and have children. And I just, really was longing for a kind of what I felt was a bigger life. And I guess it was because of this, I became drawn to people who were leading real adventurous lives. And this led me to getting involved on a social level with the mountain climbing community in Britain through my brother, my eldest brother, who was a mountain climber. And I fell in love with a high altitude Himalayan mountain climber, and found myself not being a traveler at all, but being at home while my partner, went off and had big adventures.
I was literally like, oh no, like, so he went off and you stayed at home.
Yeah. And it was, it was kind of bizarre because up to that point, I guess I'd sort of seen myself as the big traveler. I'd been away in South America for a whole year, traveled in Peru and Bolivia and Argentina. And suddenly, I fell in love with this guy. His name was Joe Tasker. He was a very famous mountaineer. And my first thought, of course, was, maybe I can take time off work and go to base camp with him, but he didn't want me to do that because he was so focused on his climbing. And we were together for almost 3 years. And it was the first time I really felt I'd found someone who I wanted to stay with. I'd had a whole series of boyfriends up to that point, but I really fell in love with this man. And it was a very difficult relationship because his commitment was to climbing, not to me. His first love was the mountain environment and high mountains and reaching these goals. And he would go away on expeditions for months at a time, which was, and really, he climbed K2, he climbed Everest in winter or attempted it. He went off on these really, really dangerous climbs, tackling very difficult routes without oxygen with small teams. And he left on 4 expeditions while we were together, the 3 years we were together. And he didn't come home from the last one. He disappeared without trace close to the summit of Everest, just after I had turned 30. So that was, to put it mildly, that was a major life changer for me.
Oh, I can't even imagine what that must have been like. How did you handle that? How did you deal with that loss?
It was really awful. It was devastating. I mean, it was, it's hard enough, obviously, to lose someone that you love in any circumstance. But in Joe's case, he literally disappeared without trace. He was with another climber and they just didn't come back. And it was thought that they'd fallen off the mountain. 10 years later, the body of the other climber, Pete Boardman, was found. And it's presumed Joe was close to him, high up on the mountain. But, when there's no concrete fact of death, when there's no body to say goodbye to, it's really hard to even really comprehend that person has really gone, and it took me a long time to stop believing that he might just walk through the door one day. So that was, at such a young age, that was a very hard blow. I had a lot of support from the climbing community. It's a real tribe, like any adventure community, right? People hang together. They understand the loss. They don't question how you're feeling. They're just there for you. So I had masses of support from the climbing tribe. They really held me up. But the problem was, so there I was in England. I had a teaching job. Joe and I were kind of living together. I kind of was accepting that maybe I'd even sort of settle down, and he was going to be the climber. And suddenly, here I was, alone and just not knowing really how to rebuild my life. And it was the interesting thing as well is that it's having that kind of a loss early on. It's something that it's not supposed to happen when you're so young, right? That kind of knowledge of what loss is really like, and it gave me this real, how can I put it? This real sort of yearning to live intensely, because suddenly I realized just how fragile life is and how everything can change in a second. And I'd had my own brush with death when I was 21. I had a near drowning accident in Morocco, and I was actually resuscitated on a beach. I was brought in not breathing. So, I had my 20s had been bracketed by this awareness of the fragility of life and how precious life is. And I suddenly thought, I've just got to get out there and live. In a way, that was Joe's legacy to me. Just do what you want to do and do it now, and don't wait. Don't waste time. Don't take things for granted. I decided to leave England for a while, and I took a teacher exchange position in Canada. It was just something that came up very quickly. I went for it. I didn't even, I knew I was going to Vancouver Island. I didn't really know much about where I was going. But off I went to a little town on the west coast of Vancouver Island, and for a year. And I completely fell in love with Canada. And I had a great stroke of luck that I met a man, completely fell in love with him. This was 4 years after Joe had died. I met Doug. He was also over from Europe and doing his PhD work. And we shared the same dream of wanting to create an adventurous life. And he was a veterinarian. I was a teacher. We got married, moved into a little house on a tiny island, started commuting by kayak to the nearest town, and within the course of a year and a half, my life had suddenly changed completely. And we decided to become a writer photographer team and throw up our real jobs, and off we went.
I just want to go back to your relationship with Joe. So you've met Joe, you've fallen in love with him, you're connecting with the mountain climbing community, but you've got these childhood dreams. You want this adventure, you want to lead, a different life from the life that your parents wanted you to lead. How easy was it for you to balance your dreams and ambitions of adventure with being the supportive partner of a mountaineer who was heading off to climb the big mountains like K2 and Everest?
That's a really good question. It wasn't easy at all. I mean, we were only together for 3 years before he died. I've often been asked if he had survived, would our relationship have continued? And, I really don't know, because I found myself, I was so in love with this man, and I found myself suddenly becoming the person at home, the nurturer, the one waiting, living vicariously through him. And it was a difficult balance, particularly because there was a lot he wouldn't give me in the relationship that I wanted. I wanted commitment. I wanted to marry him. And I knew that it was clear that really wasn't on the cards, because he was a very, very ambitious climber, and his whole thrust was towards reaching his goals, being one of the world's top mountaineers. So it was difficult, and it was a cause of conflict, because by that time I had a teaching job. I was actually teaching Vietnamese refugees in a reception center, and I had flexibility to take holidays when I wanted. And I really did want to go to base camp with him. I thought that would be amazing, to trek into these fantastic places. And it was always, no, I've got to be really focused. When he left on a climb, he compartmentalized. He just shut down his emotions and off he went. And he always said, if I was there with him, it would be too much of a distraction. So, yeah, that's the long answer. And the short answer is, yes, it was difficult.
Yeah. No, I think it's really interesting, because the words that I'm thinking of are the sacrifices made to be with a partner who is almost so focused, but is almost inherently selfish, because he's just got his goals, his dreams, his focus, and it just doesn't seem like a balanced relationship.
It wasn't. It's something I explored a lot. I wrote a book. We can get onto that later. But my first book was a memoir about my relationship with Joe. And I actually went to Everest after he died on a pilgrimage. I trekked up to Everest Base Camp, 21,000 feet, as a pilgrimage, sort of try and come to terms with the fact that he wasn't coming home. But years later, and a number of other books later, I came back to the subject. I wrote a book called Where the Mountain Casts Its Shadow, when I examined the emotional impact of mountaineering on the people at home, the parents, the partners, the children. I had to kind of give myself space, and it was a long space before I could really go back and really dive into this subject. But another sort of interesting side of all of this was I had, in order to stay with him, to survive in that relationship, I had become super independent. I developed this really hard shell, I suppose. And, I had my own life when he was away. And then after he died, that shell stayed with me. I was terrified of being hurt again. And it was really difficult, to have any kind of relationship with anyone for a while. I would meet people, but I was just so shielded, protected, I suppose, against the fear of loss. And also I'd just become so super independent. And then I met Doug on Vancouver Island when I arrived here in Canada. And it was the first time I really fell in love again. And, when we talked about our dreams, and one of the things he said early on was that he wanted a really adventurous life. He wanted to travel, just really adventurous travels, but he wanted to do it with his partner, and he wanted that person, that woman, to be at the center of his life, at the center of everything he did. And my first reaction was, really? That almost seemed strange to me, because I had been with this man who had completely the opposite philosophy to a relationship, And it kind of took me a little while to adjust to that, he was somebody who wanted to have great adventures, but wanted me with him. And also, crucially, was prepared to compromise the wilder things he would have liked to do because I didn't feel up to doing them. That was really wonderful, but it did take me a while to kind of get used to it.
Did you have, when you meet, is it Dag or Doug? Dag.
Yeah, it's, all these years later, I still can't pronounce his name properly. It's Dag, so there's Dag. It's a Norwegian name.
It's a Norwegian name. Did you have a meet cute or a cute meet? Have you heard of that?
What's a cute meet?
It's like in the romantic comedies and movies when like a couple meet and they meet in a really like cute way. Have you got like a cute how you met story?
Well, yes, I do. It's a funny story. We've got different versions. He always tells people I stalked him in a supermarket, in the produce, in the fruit and veg section. It's not true. So I arrived in Canada. I'd been there 6 months living in this town called Nanaimo, which back then was a real kind of rough and tumble, kind of a redneck edge to it, And I would go off to Vancouver, every weekend and, sort of meet friends there. But I didn't expect to meet anyone that I could relate to in this town, to be honest. And then one day I saw this gorgeous man in the supermarket, and I kind of, saw it and thought, wow, I wonder where he came from. And he looked very European. Doug had been living in Berlin and in Munich, and he had this kind of very European style to him, Then I saw him again on a ferry coming from Vancouver to Vancouver Island. And his story is that he was asleep, and his story is that he opened his eyes and saw this woman kind of staring at him, which I suppose I was. And then another friend of mine came up and chatted to me, so that was that. And then about a week later, I had started, of all things, Tai Chi classes. I was sort of interested in trying Tai Chi, and I'd been doing it for about 3 months. And then he walked into the class one night and said to the instructor, could he just watch? And it was excruciating because, I don't know if you've ever done Tai Chi, but until you're good at it, you kind of look a bit, I looked pretty dorky doing it. I wasn't good. And here was this man, who I'd seen and really fancied, and there he was standing watching me doing Tai Chi very, very badly. And at the end of the class, I kind of strategically walked past him and we started chatting. And he says he didn't say this, but he did. He said, haven't I seen you somewhere before? And that was the beginning. We went out for a drink.
Okay, and now we get on to the next part, because you shared this passion for adventure and exploration. And what did you decide to do after you got married?
Well, kind of the adventure and well, another thing is we got married basically to keep me in the country. It wasn't a big romantic engagement or anything. It was like, my teaching year was up. I got a job as a nanny. I hated, that didn't work out well. And so Doug's a Canadian citizen, and out of the blue, he said, okay, let's get married. And he said he later he felt like it was an out of body experience, because he never thought he would ever get married, not for many years. He was only 29 at the time. So we had already moved to this tiny little island, which is a mile off the coast of Vancouver Island. And he built us a couple of kayaks, and I'd got over my fear of deep water, which has stayed with me since my drowning incident when I was 21. And we were, getting to and from the nearest town by kayak. And we started exploring further afield, along the coast of BC by kayak. And then we went off to Mexico. We bought a folding kayak. My parents gave us the money to buy a folding kayak for our wedding present. I'd already written my first book then about my relationship with a mountaineer. And Doug had a teaching job at the college by this time. He was trained as a vet, but he got this academic job. And he had the chance to take a year sabbatical. He'd only been working for, I think, 3 years, and he had the chance to take this 1 year sabbatical. And so we jumped at the chance. And long story short, borrowed a load of money, got some sponsorship, and came up with this crazy idea to go around the world for a year with a folding kayak and kayak in really wild places. And that's what we did. We just put this plan together and scraped up enough money and set off. And we spent 3 months in the Solomon Islands, exploring, really wild places there. We kayaked down the River Ganges from Haridwar down to Varanasi. We were 6 weeks on the River Ganges. We kayaked the length of Lake Malawi. We went to Europe, kayaked down the rivers Inn and Danube as far as Budapest. And then we went to Ireland and kayaked on one of the peninsulas there. And it was this massive adventure. We'd only been married a few years at this point. It kind of changed everything. It was like, this is what we want to do, and I got a book contract to write my second book, which I called A Boat in Our Baggage. And Doug is a fantastic photographer, and he sold photographs to National Geographic and lots of newspapers. And along the way, we were actually in India. He found out that he'd been made redundant from his job. And because he had a sabbatical, he was supposed to go back to this job, but there'd been some massive cuts at the college. And we went out and celebrated because, it was like we'd been on this diving board, wanting to really jump off into this freelance life, but holding back because one of us had a job with a pension plan and benefits and, a monthly paycheck. And, that's all very kind of, that was kept pulling us back. And suddenly that was gone. And we're like, great, this is it. We're going to be freelancers from now on.
The web around, did you have a blog or anything or a way to share your stories?
We left on that trip at the end of 1991. There was no web. I don't think there were cell phones back then. We had something with us called an EPIRB, a global positioning device in case we ever were in, really terrible situations. But we often didn't take it with us because, for example, in the Solomon Islands, we left some stuff behind in the capital. And Doug told me when we were out in the middle of nowhere that he didn't bring it because who would come and get us anyway? It was a truly wild trip in that way. We were out of contact for weeks on end. And I remember in the Solomon Islands, the beginning of the trip, we were there kayaking, we'd camp on beaches, we'd pull up in villages. I mean, for us, adventure has always been, we've always wanted adventure to take us deeply into other cultures. It's always about the people in the countries that we're traveling to that we're really interested. So traveling by kayak was wonderful because in the Solomon Islands, everybody traveled then by dugout canoe. So, I mean, we kind of had what looked like to them a very weird dugout canoe. We had a folding kayak, but because we arrived at their villages by water and under our own steam, they really accepted us and were intrigued. And But, sometimes we'd be in villages where there were radios, where we could get messages out if we needed to. But quite often we were on little islands out in the middle of nowhere. And I remember sometimes Doug would, he was free diving then, and he'd go off beyond the reef with a weight belt, and I'd see his flippers, and then he'd go under the water and he'd be gone, for minutes. And I'd be sitting there thinking, well, there's sharks out there, and what if he doesn't come back? What do I do? There's nobody I can call, So it was like that in India too. It was like that in Malawi. It was a true adventure in that sense, that we didn't really have backup that we'd have today if we went and did that.
Who did you know who was living a life like this? Did you have any role models in this space, or anyone that you looked up to and thought, actually, yeah, I want to live a life like them?
Well, I mean, my mountaineering partner, Joe Tasker, had, he'd become a professional mountaineer. So I'd seen how somebody could write books, write articles, do presentations, get sponsorship. I'd watched him and his friends doing that. So I had a role model in that sense that, and that's what we began to do before we even left on the trip. We already, I had a book contract. I'd already started writing, for The Guardian. I'd written some articles for them already. I knew that I could probably generate some income along the way, but I mean, it was very different. I remember sitting in the Solomon Islands. I actually got a commission to write a story for the New York Times, which was incredibly exciting. But we didn't even have faxes then, I think. I can't remember, maybe there were faxes, but I'd sent them a little proposal, and they, accepted it. And then I was sort of on a borrowed typewriter typing this story out, back in the capital. So I had the role models of the professional mountaineers. And apart from that, we'd met a couple of sailors, round the world sailors, who were making their living through their adventures. But no, there weren't that many people doing it. And certainly, we were, as expedition kayakers, we were very much pioneers. And I guess I hadn't really realized that until we got back and I started writing the articles about our trip, and we'd started giving multimedia presentations at symposiums, etc. And suddenly everybody was quite excited because expedition kayaking wasn't, there's only a few people who'd done that. And I mean, Paul Thoreau had kayaked in the Solomons, I think just before us or something, but they weren't, we didn't know anyone else who'd kayaked down the Ganges, for example, on the length of Lake Malawi. We hadn't thought of ourselves as pioneers, but people kept telling us we were. So
one of the things that you talked about was planning versus being flexible, and never really having a plan and just going with the flow and being open to the opportunities as they become available. Is that something that you've always done? Have you always just gone with the flow? Have you ever sort of set out with a plan or a structure or goals or things that you want to achieve?
Well, in some ways, yes. Yeah. I mean, when we set off to travel around the world with a kayak, I had a book contract. We had around the world flights. We had places that we definitely wanted to go to, and we did follow that. I mean, we didn't know what would happen when we got to those places. For example, we had this idea that we would kayak on the River Ganges, starting in Haridwar, where the river flows into the plains. But, we basically arrived in Delhi and started trying to find out how we could do this. Did we need permission? We hadn't been able to find that out before. Was there somebody who could accompany us for at least the beginning of the trip, to help us along the way? So, we basically just arrived there and then started making it up, but we were determined to be on the river, and we didn't know how long it would take us, so there was a structure, but within that structure, we were very open to, we didn't have set itineraries at all. So, for example, in India, we met one person who, he'd organized climbing expeditions, and I met him through some climbing contacts. And, he wanted us to have ground support and meet jeeps along the way and, etc. But we were like, no, we want to kayak down the river and see where we end up and meet villagers. And, so we knew how we wanted to do these things, but we always left things open-ended, so that within that structure, things could evolve. So, for example, at the very end of the trip, we were supposed to be kayaking in Alaska, but Doug had got malaria in Malawi, and so recovering from that delayed us. So it was too late for us to go to Alaska. So we thought, we finished our trip on the Danube. We thought, okay, we'll go to Ireland, paddle on the west coast. Great.
Talk to me a little bit more about hidden places. Where did that idea come from, and how easy was it to set up?
What happened there was, I mentioned before that we'd made our names as expedition kayakers through my book, A Boat in Our Baggage, and all the presentations, etc. we did. And the next big expedition that we did after that was, we went to Vietnam. And this is another example of open-ended planning. I got a book contract. We thought we were going to buy a boat, a sampan, and sail it up the coast of Vietnam. We got there and we found out that was completely impossible. So we ended traveling up the coast by local boats with fishermen on bikes. We cycled 800 miles on these old local bikes, and etc. And we got to this place in the north called Halong Bay, which I'm sure you've heard of, and we explored it with a fisherman on his boat, and thought, this is the most amazing kayaking destination ever. We've got to come back here and kayak. But at that point, this was 1994, it was impossible to get permission to go kayaking there. Or very, very difficult. Anyway, so I was back in Canada. I was writing the book about our Vietnam trip, and I got a phone call one day from a guy called Olaf Malver, who worked for an American travel company called Mountain Travel Sobeck. And he asked me if Doug and I he'd read my book, he'd heard all about us, about our kayaking adventures, and he said that the company was setting up a new program for international kayaking trips, commercial kayaking trips. And he wanted to know if we would work for them part-time, developing trips and guiding them. So that was his first question. And his second question was, and can you suggest some destinations? I just said, well, we've just come back from the most incredible kayaking destination ever in Halong Bay. And a few months later, Doug was on his way there, with Olaf to scout out the bay. So we became, quite by accident, we became kayak guides and working to develop kayak destinations in different parts of the world, which, as you can imagine, was kind of a dream job that just landed in our laps. We were heading off to Turkey and Greece and different places, checking out for kayaking trips and then leading them. And we did this for a number of years part-time. Doug was also working part-time as a large animal vet in Europe, in Wales and Ireland, and I was writing books. And then eventually we decided to set up on our own, and with the blessing of Mountain Travel Sobeck, we wanted to always be guiding together, which they weren't prepared for us to do all the time, and we also wanted to develop some pretty wild trips. So we set up Hidden Places in 2000. Again, we decided that our first trips would be in the Solomon Islands, which had hardly any tourist infrastructure even then. We had to ship everything over. We had to do everything from scratch. We led some really wild out there trips for people. And actually, Mountain Travel Sobeck subcontracted us for the first few years as well. They sent us groups, and people still say it was the biggest adventures of their lives, because it was pretty sketchy actually, because we were out there without backup really. But that's how it all began. So we started it because we had this real addiction to travel and adventure and moving around the world, and it gave us a way to do that, and also to share the places that we'd found, with other people, because, we're both very social and So, it began on a real small scale and just gradually grew. And, we never had a long-term plan. We just decided where we would like to go, where we would like to lead trips, how we'd like to lead them, and would just contact people and say, hey, do you want to come along? There was never any 5-year plan. There was never any exit strategy. There was none of that. It was just like, it really grew organically, like everything else has done in our lives.
Yeah. I think it's so fascinating because there's so many different ways of achieving your dreams and your goals, and whether that's planning, whether that's being flexible, whether that's just going with the flow and making these U-turns and trying new things out. What is your definition of adventure? What does adventure mean to you?
I think it means not knowing the outcome, really. I think it means being really open, not having an absolutely set plan. I mean, adventure is stepping into the unknown, and that can be in all sorts of ways. It doesn't have to be travel, right? I mean, embarking into a relationship is a huge adventure. You just don't know where it's going. So it's a very good question, that. But yeah, I think for me, it's just being open to anything that comes your way, and being curious. I mean, I think I've always been driven, it's back to Alice in Wonderland, right? I've always been driven by curiosity. I want to know what the world's like. I want to know what these cultures are like. I want to know how people live. I want to know how the air in other countries smells, how the earth feels under my feet. And that's what drives me. And that's always what I love, about arriving in another place. It's like, everything is different here. And how is it different? Why is it different? Let's find out.
So I know you're writing a memoir at the moment about choosing to be an adventurer instead of a mother. I'd just love to hear more from your perspective about that choice and about that decision.
Yeah, I'm still in the writing process, so I can't give too much away, simply because that's almost like it's almost like superstition, I'm still sort of, I'm about 3/4 of the way through the book. So why I made the decision, I think even for women like myself, who from early on didn't really want children, I think it's still a very complicated decision for most women. And I'm exploring that in the book. Early on, for me, I think I mentioned earlier on in our conversation, I had these two kind of life-defining events. I nearly died myself when I was 21, when I drowned and was resuscitated. And then when I was 30, I lost my partner in a tragic accident. Both of those things at first made me fearful about having children, because it was like, if it's this awful to lose a partner, what would it be like to lose a child? And it was almost like, I'm so brave in so many areas of my life, but I wasn't, for in my 30s, I was terrified. Even with my husband, I developed separation anxiety. Sometimes if he went off, kayaking on his own, just locally, I'd be beside myself thinking I might never see him again, and it was the residues of that trauma, obviously, I realize now. That was one part of it, but also I did want a lot of freedom to have the kinds of adventures that we're talking about, where everything is open-ended, things can change very suddenly. And I guess I felt that if I had a child, that would be a different path for me. I would need to be more grounded, more settled. And that's not the same for everybody, but I think it would be for me. That's what I'm exploring in the book. And also, I don't want to give too much away, but I'm hoping it will be an inspiring model for the child-free choice, because I'm in my 60s now, and it's for me. I think I hope it's going to be an interesting perspective, because I'm also I'm looking back at that choice, but also I'm looking at my life now and ahead. Most of my friends are becoming grandmothers, and how does that feel now?
I think it's a really important topic, actually, that needs more discussion. or not necessarily discussion, but more hearing more viewpoints about it and hearing different perspectives, because it's almost something that it's difficult to talk about. Like, because I felt awkward even like asking the question, because it's such a personal question. It's something that I think I've learned over the years, to never ask somebody when they're having children, just because you never know what's going on behind the scenes, and it's it's very complicated, I'd say. So I think this will be fantastic. Do you have a date of when the book's going to be published?
No, I don't actually. I'm writing it. I haven't even found or looked for a publisher yet. I'm sort of just plunging into this, 3/4 of the way through, and then I am going to be approaching publishers soon, I think. But I kind of wanted really to know where it was going, because it's it's kind of I had stopped writing. I mean, I wrote 12 books back to back for years, and then I stopped after my last book was published in 2008. I took a break to focus on our business, because it was growing by then, and my husband was really carrying most of the work, and the last book that I wrote was a huge endeavor, and I was pretty burnt out. So I thought, okay, I'll just take a break, and that break just went on and on and on, and I turned back to writing fairly recently, and this this topic kind of took me by surprise. I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do, and it's a memoir, I guess, and my very first book was a memoir, and now this is a memoir, although it's also a travel narrative, because I'm telling a lot of stories about our lives together. But yeah, it's been a really fascinating process, to examine it, examine this whole subject, which I guess I hadn't given that much, I hadn't sort of reflected back on for a while, but as I say, I'm hoping it will be inspiring and thought-provoking.
I have no doubt that it will be inspiring and thought-provoking. Maria, where can people find more information about you and Dag, and follow along with your journeys and read more about your adventures and trips?
Our website is hiddenplaces.net. We're on Facebook, Hidden Places Travel. I have a personal Facebook page. I've just started a personal Twitter account very recently. Please join me on Twitter. I think it's at Coffey Books. I can't even remember my handle or whatever it's called. I don't know. We're on Instagram, Inside Hidden Places. Yeah, it's a lot of work keeping up with all this social. I don't know how people do all these adventures and keep up with social media at the same time. It's really difficult.
And actually, Maria, I'd love to give you the opportunity, for final words of advice for other women listening who want more travel, they want more adventure, they want more freedom, they want to step off the beaten track and follow their childhood dreams. What would be your advice?
I would say, just go for it, girl. Just don't fear, don't overthink things. Don't think too far into the future. Just let go of fear, and if you find a path that really says to you, follow me, follow it, and see where it takes you, and you'll be surprised. and be open. I think the other thing is, this is probably terrible advice to give to anybody, but don't have too much of a plan. Be flexible, be prepared to take some massive U-turns if some new opportunities that you hadn't expected come up. And so stay light on your feet if you can, so that you can grab those opportunities, you can follow that path.
Yeah. I'm a big planner. And I've, I like for the decade, 2020, I thought, perfect, let's, decade plan. What am I going to achieve over the next 10 years? Big picture, vision board, setting it all out, all my goals and everything. And then 2020 happened. It's just
I know.
But then exactly like you said, you've actually got to be like, right, let's pivot, let's be flexible. And I suppose sometimes it's about learning how to go with a flow. For me, I think it's about it's wanting to get that balance between having that flexibility and being able to take U-turns, but also having a goal and a plan to work towards, but being flexible with the method on how to get there.
Maybe, yeah, have a structure, but within that structure, just be really flexible and be independent if you can. If everything else falls away, have something that will keep you going, that will hold you up for a while. But otherwise, just go for it.
Maria, thank you so much for coming on Tough Girl Podcast and sharing more about your life. It's been absolutely inspiring to hear more about, the challenges that you face and overcome, and the life that you've lived and the freedom that you've had and what you've achieved. I know people will love to read all of your books, and so I will make sure that I share all of those links in the show notes. But Marie, thank you so much for coming on Tough Girl Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me along.
Hey Tribe, I hope you enjoyed the episode with Maria. Everything that we have talked about today will be available in the show notes at toughgirlchallenges.com. So please do go check it out. For those of you who are new to the podcast, my name is Sarah Williams. I'm the host of the Tough Girl Podcast and the founder of Tough Girl Challenges, which is all about motivating and inspiring you. On the 8th of July, we're going to be speaking with Preet Shandy. She is an army physiotherapist and ultra runner who is training for her first solo unsupported expedition to the South Pole. I'm just going to share a little bit more about Preet, who she is and what she does. So this is Preet in her own words. I've always been ambitious and enjoyed pushing my boundaries. I had limited knowledge of polar travel when I decided I wanted to do a solo Antarctic expedition. I wanted to inspire people to believe in themselves. Nobody starts out as an expert. Everybody starts somewhere. You learn as you go, and the more you learn, the closer it brings you to your goal. I started on Google reading about polar expeditions, and now I've completed training and expeditions in Norway and Greenland, ready for my next step to Antarctica. I'm an army physiotherapist and I love adventure and finding new ways to push my limits. After playing tennis full-time as a teenager, training in the Czech Republic, I moved back to England at 19 to pursue a different path and to gain my degree in physiotherapy. This will remain one of my biggest achievements as I came back to the UK with minimal GCSEs and no A-levels. I completed my first half marathon at the age of 20. This progressed to ultra marathons, and I'm now training for a 700-mile solo, unsupported expedition in Antarctica. This expedition will make me the first Asian female to complete a solo journey on the continent. Hopefully, it will inspire so many other people. Its aims is to inspire future generations in achieving whatever they desire and pushing boundaries. It is a solo expedition, but I want to bring as many people on the journey with me as possible. So massive thank you for Preet for coming on the Tough Girl Podcast. You can listen to that episode. It is coming out next week. New episodes go live every Tuesday and Thursday at 7 a.m. UK time. So make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out. The Tough Girl Podcast is sponsorship and ad free, and that's thanks to the monthly financial support of patrons. To find out more about supporting the Tough Girl Podcast, please visit Patreon, patreon.com/Tough Girl Podcast. You can support in US dollars, sterling, and euros. There's monthly options as well as annual options. And trust me, every single patron matters. Every little piece of support really does make a massive difference in helping to increase the amount of female role models in the media. So a massive thank you to every single patron who is out there supporting the work that I do. I could not do this without you. So thank you so much. And wherever you are, whatever you are doing, just have an incredible day. Give it your all. Give it 110%. Get after it. Go for it. Believe in yourself because I believe in you. Take care and I'll speak to you soon. Bye.